thinking and learning and exchange. So the Critical Race Studies program, which was founded around 2000, has really a mission to think, teach, and transform. The real goal is to think new ideas, to teach, and by teaching we mean not only teaching faculty, teaching students, but all of us teaching each other, as the couple panels that we'll see in the morning will really emphasize, and to really transform. The idea is to translate our new thoughts into ideas and action that will actually change the way that social justice is practiced within law and without. The goal is to transform legal institutions in some sense, because we are lawyers or lawyers in training, but as we all know, the interplay between race and gender and sexual orientation and law and society includes lots of different sort of swirling vectors of causation, and the whole point is to think very hard about them, and again to transform as much as possible all of our interesting thoughts and our teachings into actual practice that furthers social justice. So I'm delighted we have an annual symposium. We had a really fantastic symposium last year where we had a huge number of absolute stars come in, and this year we also have a fantastic symposium, and we have a remarkable talent. In the morning we'll be showcasing people who are more, in some sense, local, especially our students who have worked really hard on various issues, and I'm excited about the actual academic and intellectual and social interchange to come. As you know from all the material, the title of the symposium is Race, Sexuality, and the Law, Abercrombie, Imus, and Beyond. In the afternoon, we will have faculty panels that talk about marketplace and desire, focusing, for example, on the Abercrombie issue, and the ways in which the logic of the marketplace creates particular modes of advertisement that appeal to particular racial tropes as well as homoerotic ideas to actually sell stuff, but in ways that are complicated. And I think we'll have an excellent discussion there. And later on in the afternoon, there's another panel called Misrepresentation and Misogyny, and if you wanted an exemplar or an example of that, it would be the Imus example and what he said about a particular basketball team, women of color, transgendered people, how it is that these intersectional identities are being described, portrayed, framed, subordinated through mass media. And in both, you'll see themes of how market rationality and just trying to make a buck, and how the structures of what it means to make economic sense conflicts with our conceptions of social justice. And we'll have a fantastic keynote with Dwight McBride. But we start now, in some sense, with really an interesting panel, and there will be an introduction soon. I just wanted to, as faculty director, welcome you to a really interesting day of engagements. I hope I get a chance to talk with many of you. I'll be in and out in the morning because I have some meetings that I have to attend to, but I'll be here for most of the day, and I really look forward to this exchange. So welcome. Thanks for coming out on a Friday as early as 9 a.m., and I think the panel shall begin. Thank you. Katie?
Good morning, everybody. It's nice to see everybody this early in the morning. This panel, like Professor Kang said, is representing 5 of our students from UCLA that are currently engaging in projects or have recently written on their projects, just addressing the different avenues and venues in which gender, race, and sexuality intersect, and the various impacts that law can have on our bodies, our sexual health, being in the prison industrial complex, an avenue of different kinds of projects, which is really exciting. So with that, we're just going to go ahead and get started because we are running a little behind time. The first panelist is Leah Goodridge. She is currently a second-year law student at UCLA School of Law. She founded Proyecto Líder, which is actually the title of our project really speaks to what happened within that organization and how it kind of came to be founded. She's a graduate of Vassar. She's also established another program, Brookhaven Language Exchange, which is an English as a second language program for immigrant female survivors of domestic violence. She's written several articles on human rights, gender, and race for nonprofits, such as the National Urban League, Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, and now Legal Defense Fund. She's currently the assistant manager of the Journal of International Law and Foreign Affairs, and she is interested in the intersectionality of race, gender, and international laws. The title of her paper is Gender, Health, and Human Rights in the Dominican Republic, the case of Proyecto Líder. So with that, Leah. Oh, you need to start.
Good morning, everyone. So I am going to begin my presentation by just making the comment that I decided to really get into the CRS program before coming to law school, because it really hit me that Basically that the world has really not embraced the concept of intersectionality. And I've seen that throughout the past few months with the presidential primaries, because I've gotten the following question probably about 15 times, and the question is, well, which is more important to you, your race or your gender? And I've gotten into the habit now of responding, well, you know, which is more important to you, water or food? And so, you know, you can't really go. And so I am going to begin speaking of Proyecto Líder, which is an organization that I founded in the Dominican Republic. And okay, sure. People often ask me why I chose to go to the Dominican Republic and work primarily with a girls' leadership organization, or even establish a girls' leadership organization. And the one experience that I can point to, thank you.
You want to run the show? And
the one experience that I can point to is I was a sophomore in college. I was studying abroad in Cuba, and I was the only person of color in my study abroad group, and we were in this tourist zone looking for souvenirs, and all of a sudden I was sort of like off on the side looking at these dolls, and this other foreigner, I thought he may have been from Germany or something, came up to me speaking Spanish, and I thought, well, since he was speaking Spanish to me, maybe he didn't realize that I was American or whatever. He had to have been German or something. And then I realized that he was actually soliciting me for, he was soliciting me for some sort of prostitution. And then I spoke with other Cuban women, Afro-Cuban women, and they said, well, that happens all the time. It didn't matter that I was wearing like a shirt that said Vassar College, or you could have been wearing a business suit, but simply because you have darker skin, well, white European and American men who travel abroad, they'll just assume that you're a prostitute. And what ended up happening is, throughout the conversation with him, since I just assumed that he was German, because I thought, well, if he were American, he would clearly hear my gringo accent too, I realized that he was actually American. And so that was really the sort of intersectionality between race, nationality, and all these different things. And so that's what motivated me to go to the Caribbean and establish a girls' leadership organization primarily in reproductive health. So, I went to, great if I could read, great. I went to the Dominican Republic, which is the second largest nation in the Caribbean. It has a population of 9 million. And the workforce, the female workforce, is only 35%. And so I founded Proyecto Líder, and I went there actually not with the mindset to establish a nonprofit organization, but really to lead a series of seminars on reproductive health. And so I sort of went there with a Fulbright Watson mentality, like I'm only going to be here for 1 year and that's it. But what happened was I started working with these young girls, and I had the fellowship money, and the program really started having an impact. And so the actual fellowship evolved into an organization, and we called it LEADER, which stands for Leadership, Identity, Development, Education, and Realization. So I should have that down here. So the Dominican Republic and Haiti both account for 85% of the region's HIV/AIDS cases. And I'll just go off with the pictures because I know it well. And when I started working in the Dominican Republic, particularly in Santo Domingo and in the barrio of La Altagracia, some of the main things that I faced were just trying to get the mothers of these young girls first to allow me to teach them these things. And so AIDS and HIV was not really seen as a huge issue. And that's primarily because all of the NGOs that work in the Dominican Republic, they devote their time, but the government really doesn't, the Dominican government really doesn't have a set sex education program that really puts AIDS and HIV as a priority. Another thing that I found really sort of the intersectionality between race and nationality was that people would respond to me. I was really kind of appalled. People would sort of respond and say, well, HIV is not a Dominican issue, it's a Haitian issue. And of course the Dominican Republic and Haiti share an island. And so what I learned there was that Dominicans, even though there's such a heavy African ancestry, that Dominicans really see themselves as distinctly different from Haitians. Even though I remember speaking to the girls and saying at one point, well, you know, most people, black or not, or Asian or whatever, wouldn't really see a huge difference between the people of the Dominican Republic and Haiti. They wouldn't necessarily say, well, the people of the Dominican Republic are white and Catholic and the people of Haiti are black. Of course, there's mixture in the Dominican Republic, but there's also mixture in Haiti. And so some of the difficulties that I found in teaching about HIV/AIDS was that there was just a mind frame that this was not a Dominican issue. So this picture is actually a photo that I think speaks 1,000 words, because it was here on the left, on the right here is my friend Sarah, and she came in to teach the girls really nothing about HIV and AIDS, but she came in to give a seminar talk on what it was like to attend this premier university, private university at, it was Adentec in the Dominican Republic. And so she was speaking about her experience there. But I thought that the picture spoke 1,000 words because the girls in the program, they couldn't get past the fact that she was Haitian, and so it really didn't matter what she said. And so when I talk to people about the importance of HIV education and how there's really just this block between this is something that, the mindset is sort of like, this is something that affects the black body, we're not black, so why are you here teaching this? But I always sort of follow this up by saying that interestingly enough, the girls in the program, the 20 girls in the program that I worked with, they didn't really see me the same as Sarah. And so it was sort of like this xenophobia that was particular to Haiti, but it wouldn't necessarily have been particular to me as an African American. So here's a picture of Maricela, and at the time she was 13, and she was holding her nephew. And when I first went to La Gracia, and I was holding informational sessions to try and get the parents of these young girls to, have their girls in the program, there was a lot of backlash, and so their response was, well, because there's no sex education in the schools, really, and through the law, the only textbook that they recently had that even covered sex education said something like, the safest sex is marital sex. And so we all know that that's not true because, hello, you could be married to your wife or your husband, but particularly in the Dominican Republic, there's no guarantee that your spouse is going to be faithful to you, and that's how you may contract a venereal disease. And so here in this picture is Maricela. She's 13 and she's holding her nephew. And the reason why I have this picture up is because when I first held the informational sessions, there's a huge disjuncture between sort of the surface reaction that really went along with, well, we're Catholic and we don't want to learn about sex education. We don't want to learn, we don't feel like this is important. And that was the initial reaction that I had when I held the informational session in the church. But then months later, when there was sort of, we had an impact where the girls started changing and saying, well, maybe I don't need to get married at 17, maybe I don't need to have a boyfriend now. Their mothers came and thanked me, and so I had that picture up because there was like a reaction that I saw on the surface, but then a deeper reaction that said, well, thank God, because I'm so tired of being a grandmother, and that's literally what some of them said. Here is, I'm sorry. Okay. one of the things that I faced when basically teaching the young girls in the program was that I went primarily with the mindset to teach reproductive health. And so the problem and the issue that I faced is that I can't teach young girls to take care of their own bodies if they don't really know or care about the bodies that they're in. And a lot of that had to do with race. And so many of the young girls in the first meeting that I held with them, I asked them, well, what do you want to do with your lives? How do you see yourselves? What do you want to do? You know, I have my vision of the program, but how can I help you basically? What can I implement in the program? And so this was our first informational session. And so one girl said, well, I want to get married, and hopefully I'll get married to a man who's lighter than me, and so then I can have lighter babies, and that's what I want to do. I want to be a housewife. And then like all the rest of them said it, and so it was sort of like, oh, okay, well, you can do that, but, you know, well, how exactly do you see yourselves? And I remember one day when we had the Sarah, who is a Haitian visitor, well, I don't call her that, but the question came up, and I said, well, how do you see you and me and Sarah as being all different? And so really that sort of hit the nail on the head. And I sort of realized by their response at that moment that sort of this disjuncture between trying to teach people and these young girls of how to take care of themselves and having this sort of educational program, well, it wasn't going to work if they didn't feel like they deserved it, and if they didn't feel like they wanted to use the tools, you know, to take care of their own bodies. And so their response was sort of like, well, we're white and you're foreign and Sarah's Haitian. And so there were all of these different notions of the black body. And so what I saw there was, first I saw all of these sort of the difference between the one-drop rule in the U.S. and in Latin America. But certainly what I saw was that, particularly in the Dominican Republic, that there was a reverse one-drop rule where it was any sort of non-black white blood that you had in you allowed you to navigate through this whole like mulatto escape hatch, et cetera, et cetera. But that wasn't necessarily true in a lot of different areas that we traveled to. For example, we weren't able to get in, and so we would take field trips, for example, to different sectors in Santo Domingo. And, we would take field trips in different sectors of Santo Domingo, and in the Dominican Republic, there's some spaces where it just doesn't matter like who you are, what your social class level is, but you're just not allowed to get in. And so we weren't, like literally, sometimes we're not allowed to get into certain museums because they just sort of looked at us and said, well, you're black, you're moreno, whatever it is that you are. And so all of us actually in the program, and so it was sort of like this imagination of where your body, where the black body could fit in, but only within certain areas of society. And so, for example, the girls might say, well, I'm Taino Indian here, but I won't be Taino Indian in terms of getting into a museum in an upper class sector in Santo Domingo. And so with that, that is the end of my presentation. So thank you.
Okay, our next panelist is Amanda Simpson. She's a third-year law student at UCLA. She did her undergraduate at UCLA as well, and worked in a family law office before attending law school. She's a member of the business law program. She's been involved in the Raza Law Students, or Law Students Association all 3 years and served on the board her second year. She's also competed in the UCLA triathlon team for the last 3 years, which is very impressive. And after school, she's going to be working at a real estate law firm in San Diego, and eventually wants to work on land use and housing for low-income Latino families in San Diego. So, and the title of her paper is The Clash of Minorities, the Intersection of the Queer and Latino Struggles.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. My name is Amanda Allen Simpson, my maiden name, and I'm a 3L here at UCLA, like she said. And I just wanted to first orientate myself with how I came to be here this morning. Last semester I had the opportunity to take 2 courses that really exemplified the intersectionality of race and sexuality. I took Law and Sexuality, as well as Latinos in the Law, which is taught from a critical race studies perspective. And in taking these and my own personal experiences in the past few years, I really found that the intersection of Latinos and sexual orientation is complex and on many levels, personal, within the communities, and on a national level. So that's where I started from. I personally identify as a Chicana. I'm half Mexican, half white. And recently, about a year and a half ago, my brother came out as a Latino gay man, and I really started to think about the complexities within my own family, within my culture, and then on a larger level. So that is what took me down this direction. Let me see here. So I started my paper really with a personal narrative. The reason being, I really think that narratives and personal stories help to elucidate some of the legal concepts that we're trying to deal with. And I think her personal story of her study abroad program is what really takes us to that next level and really getting into these issues. So I started my paper inspired by William Rubenstein's piece, My Harvard Law School. I don't know if any of you have read that, but it's basically about his own experience in learning to be a gay man at Harvard Law School, which you wouldn't think law school can be extremely stifling for any minority. But Cambridge and everything presented itself as an opportunity to really figure out who he was. So I started, after reading that, I thought this personal narrative is really important. So I started there, and then I headed into the history of the gay rights movement, and particularly focused on the exclusion of Latinos from the story that's being told. If you look at the 1969 Stonewall riots, when that story is told, rarely is it mentioned the impact of race. Sylvia Rivera, the one who fought back, dressed as a drag queen, really was instrumental in that moment in time. And yet when the story's retold, there is a lack of inclusion of race. And Elvia Ariola wrote this piece, Fairies, Marimachas, Queens, and Lesis, The Construction of Sexuality Before the 1969 Stonewall Riots. And you see this moment in time where there's civil rights happening, and there's also the gay rights movement happening. And nowhere in there do we see an explicit acknowledgement of the intersection of these two moments in time. Particularly in the 50s and 60s, when the bar raids were happening, people of color, queers of color, were attacked more often than others. And so I think in retelling the history of the movement, it's important to include those who have been left out, because otherwise they're forgotten, and it's much easier to think about these two movements as distinct. And I talk about them as distinct concepts, but in reality what I'm trying to argue is that their overlap and intersection is really what will drive each movement further in the future. So that was my first point. Stepping forward, I moved into the cultural construct of Latinos and gender and sexuality, and the interplay between performance and actual biological gender. So in the Latino culture, it's very much driven that men should be machismo, they're macho, and they should perform their gender accordingly, and women should be docile, want to get married, and present themselves, perform their female role. And so when these roles are not performed, that's where you see the conflict within the Latino community and the gay rights movement. So, for example, when my brother came out, the first thing he said was, "Don't worry, Mom and Dad, I'm not going to be like a drag queen or marching in any parades." And for me, it really meant, for him, he was still trying to fit into the masculine male stereotype of the Latino culture, even though I'm a gay man, but I'm not that gay, trying to fit into the construct that's been created. In analyzing this gender and sexual orientation conflation within the Latino culture, I really see it as almost a double whammy. There's Francisco Valdez calls it a double whammy, where there's two tiers of social oppression and subordination. You see it first in your family, not maybe wearing a mask in your family with your sexual orientation, and then out in the gay world possibly trying to be less, acting out less of your culture and race to fit into the gay community, which oftentimes can be very Eurocentric and white. And so that headed into the larger scheme of things on a national level. And really that's where you see the clash, because the two movements don't see each other. The Latino civil rights movement and the gay rights movement don't actually see each other on very general level as intersecting, and we see that play out in the media in cases. Goodridge v. Department of Public Health, one of the big successes for same-sex marriage in Massachusetts, was explicitly created that case with white couples, parents trying to create this aura of normalcy, of being more accepted by mainstream society. But in doing that, I think you leave out those on the outskirts, transgender, queers of color, and in doing that it really hurts the movement as a whole, and it produces an actual harm for Latinos and the movement itself by being exclusionary. So what happens, so I asked the question, what happens if we divest ourselves of these theories of normalcy and actually expand the movement to include poor, queers of color, transgender in a more inclusionary role? And so I gave a few examples of this. The Sylvia Rivera Law Project was recently founded in New York City by one of our own, Dean Spade, and he's going to be actually speaking later today. So if you guys can catch that, it's in the afternoon session. But it's a really amazing project that is inclusionary, coalition building, and it works towards embracing the intersection of both race and class and gender and sexuality. And one example is the intersection of trans rights and immigration rights, getting IDs and those sorts of things, attacking it on an administrative level. It's really innovative and really progressive. And then another example is the Gay Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, GLAAD, has worked very recently to more publicly recognize the depiction of gays and lesbians on television, in particular people of color, the hyper-sexualized queers of color on TV, and they've started the People of Color Media Project. And Monica Tajer was the media project leader there, and she's currently working with Spanish language television to work with the depiction of LGBT Latinos on Spanish TV. So those are just some great examples. Lastly, Honor Pack. is a political action committee here in California working towards influencing electoral candidates and bills on issues of gay rights and legislation that's currently being put through. First, Dolores Huerta is extremely active. She's worked with the United Farm Workers, is what she's most known for, and just a huge civil rights activist. And she's become highly involved in this honor pack. And one of their successes more recently was to pass a law that would have circumvented Proposition 22 banning same-sex marriage. It passed in the Senate and was later vetoed by Arnold Schwarzenegger, but I mean, that's a big success. She went door to door to a lot of the Latino legislators telling them why this impacts not only LGBT community but the Latino community as well, and that's huge recognition on a state legislative level. That is really amazing. So that's where it took me, and I'm just excited that these two courses allowed me to really engage with Critical Race Studies program and have this discussion, and I welcome any questions that you have.
Our next panelist is Regina Du. She is a third-year CRS student and is actually currently working on a new project involving the involuntary sterilization of Latinas at LA County USC Medical Center, and is inviting people to come and talk to her afterwards if they're interested on working on a similar related issue. And the title of our paper today is Rethinking the Anti-Domestic Violence Movement, Lesbian Women of Color as the Perfect Victim of Domestic Violence.
Good morning. Sorry for that advertisement, but kind of desperate. So when I was a 1L, I, along with Yvonne, I volunteered at APAC, which is American Pacific Asian Pacific American Legal Center. Sorry. And there we really got familiar with VAWA, which is Violence Against Women Act, and it provides remedies for victims of domestic violence. And I learned a lot, and I was really glad for it. And then that following summer, I interned at the Los Angeles Gay and Lesbian Center, where we also had a domestic violence project. But a huge difference between those two were that when we had intakes, when we were talking to clients who came in, no one really came in at the LA Gay and Lesbian Center as saying, I'm a domestic violence victim, I need help. It was usually like they came in for a different problem, and then we were like, okay, you're a victim, so we need to like help you. Because they don't, like for example, they would come in for a housing issue and like, why don't you have housing? Oh, because it didn't work out with my partner. And why didn't it work out? And then it turned out that there was a domestic violence issue. And it really like led me to ask, like, why is it that nobody can really identify themselves as a victim, as someone who really needs help? And then, so my curiosity started there, and as a 2L, when I really began taking CRS courses, we read Professor Crenshaw's Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, and in it she said, reconstructure and remake a problematic system by relocating those who are currently marginalized to the center. And that part really made me think, well, clearly there's a problem because nobody really sees themselves as the gay community, members of the gay community are not really seeing themselves as domestic violence victims. So that's when I started researching. And the thing that everyone should know about domestic violence is that there's no prototypical case of domestic violence. Every perpetrator is different and every victim is different. And so yet, when you look at like popular culture, like there's literally a website out there that lists all the movies and made-for-TV movies about domestic violence. Yet not a single one of them, I guarantee you, are about like a same-sex relationship. So, and the problem here is that one of the obstacles that the gay community faces is homophobia, which is, I think, one of the topics of this symposium. And homophobia is a huge deal for domestic violence victims because not only are they threatened by their partners if they like want to get out of the relationship, not only are they threatened by their partners that they'll be outed, but they're also, their inner homophobia keeps them from like empowering themselves because for many, like, they still haven't come out to their family members, or they don't even believe that, like, you know, maybe I deserve this because I'm in this kind of relationship. So they don't even believe that, like, they don't even identify it as domestic violence. They identify it as, like, some sort of different abuse that, like, resulted from, like, their inexperience. And at the same time, society refuses to recognize it as domestic violence because they're saying a lot of people, as you know, see homosexuality as a life choice or something unnatural. So whatever happens, whatever bad happens, has resulted from this unnatural relationship. So the reason I am emphasizing this claiming victimhood so much is that you have to claim in domestic violence discourse, one must claim themselves as a victim in order to start the process of empowerment. Because you can't really get out of that cyclical nature of domestic violence unless you have that start, until you say, I am a victim and I have to get out. Otherwise, the victim or survivor, as like domestic violence advocates would want to call them, is trapped in that cycle. So when I got this idea for the paper and I began researching, like with a lot of, I guess, my ideas, like you're really excited about it and you like find out that there's already like tons of papers written on it. So, which was helpful and kind of like disheartening but what was really helpful was there are a lot of papers written about domestic violence and race. And I know that I was really hesitant to do this, but I drew a parallel between black women and lesbian women because many black women have a problem being recognized as domestic violence victims because of how society views black women. And so like black women, lesbians don't belong, they don't fit into stereotypes of upstanding femininity. And in our society, you have to be seen as good and pure to deserve our protection. So I believe that is why like the anti-domestic violence movement has like made such huge strides, because of course everyone wants to help someone who's being battered by a person who's supposed to like protect us. You know, the husband is supposed to protect the wife, and it goes against our conscience to think like she's supposed to be protected by this person and she's being battered by this person. So, but yet for the lesbian woman, because her partner is female, even the victim doesn't realize that that's domestic violence. I mean, she's part of society and she's part of the norms and the assumptions that exist in our society. So she believes that what she's going through is not domestic violence. And even those who are aware that it is domestic violence hesitate before reaching out for help because like black women, they don't want to bring negativity, bring a negative spotlight into their community. I mean, the gay community is already under scrutiny, so they don't want outsiders to have more excuses to say, well, you know, there you go, they have more problems than what we like originally thought. So they're multi-burdened in this sense because not only do they have to deal with empowering themselves individually, but they have to deal with all these other responsibilities that come with their identity. So what my paper is about is it kind of like, okay. It sort of goes through all the problems that women of color face when it comes to obtaining remedies, and lesbian women face. And then at the intersection of all that, what lesbian women of color face when it comes to domestic violence. Because when I was at the LA Gay and Lesbian Center, almost everyone who came in were persons of color. And that's because, I mean, there is a reason. It's not because we only advertise to people of color. It's because there are that many more obstacles for them. Like maybe they don't have family here. Maybe like they have immigration issues or whatnot. And like they just have nobody to turn to. And the thing that's striking is that in California, like a state we think of as so progressive and liberal, there are only 2 organizations that specifically cater and help victims of domestic violence who are part of the gay community. And one is in San Francisco and one is in Los Angeles. And when I was working in the Los Angeles legal department at the Gay and Lesbian Center, we had federal funding for this project and they cut it. So I don't know what's going to happen with that. I end my paper with like the suggestion that there's so many like reforms to be made, and in order to like really fix this anti-domestic violence movement as much as it has done for everybody, we have to kind of like move the marginalized into the center, and in that way there will be an adequate remedy for everybody. That's all.
Fourth panelist is Shayla Myers. She's also a 3L and is enrolled in the Critical Race Studies program and the Epstein program in Public Interest Law and Policy. She graduated from Kenyon College in Ohio and spent 3 years coordinating a 24-hour rape crisis center hotline and advocacy program in her hometown, Albuquerque, New Mexico. In law school, she's been the co-chair of Outlaw and chief comments editor of the UCLA Law Review, and she is also one of 2 chief articles editors for the Journal of Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Law, and she's going to be clerking for Judge Sandra Kuta of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in Pasadena after law school. The title of Shayla's paper is A Distinction Without a Difference, Status and Conduct in Asylum Claims Based on Sexual Orientation.
Thank you so much for sitting here and listening to me talk about my paper. So this paper is a product of a couple of things. First, it started when I clerked after my first summer at the National Center for Lesbian Rights, which is one of the few LGBT organizations that has a really active immigration project. And I worked with an attorney who was doing primarily asylum work, representing LGBT people who were claiming asylum, and actually represented the client. That's sort of one of the cases that I talk about in my paper. So I wrote it my second year, and then I had the opportunity to workshop it in the Social Justice Writing Circle, which is a writing circle that was entirely student-driven that happened last semester, and it was a really amazing group of CRS students who worked on new papers, workshopped old papers, those kinds of things. So this paper has come out of that. And it's also come out of my experience in the CRS program. As a queer white woman coming to UCLA, very much my identity, I have thought of it as being a queer woman. And working within the CRS program has been an education process to think about the ways in which I am a white queer woman, to think about the way in which my racial identity has shaped my identity as a queer person. And so part of this project is to think about the way in which whiteness within the judicial system, whiteness within the adjudication of asylum claims, influences the way in which we think about the construction of asylum for queer people. I'm going to start by telling a story about asylum in the United States and sort of how it developed. So since the 1990s, the United States has granted asylum to gay men and lesbians who have been persecuted in their home countries on account of their sexual orientation. However, since that time, immigration judges and courts have refused to grant asylum to people who have been persecuted because they had sex with someone of the same sex. And the purpose of this paper is really to unpack that divide between protecting people who are persecuted because of their status as queer people and their conduct, and not protecting people because of their conduct, engaging in sexual conduct with someone of the same gender. So my comment situates this divide within a particular jurisprudential moment in the United States in the wake of Bowers v. Hardwick, which legitimized anti-sodomy statutes in the United States, but at the same time at a moment in which the country's understanding of sexual orientation was really developing as an identity characteristic, as something worth protecting in the United States. So I argue in this paper that the divide between status and conduct in current immigration law and current asylum law is really, in large part, the result of asylum law developing in that particular moment in time, in 1990. So to make this argument, I tell the story of the development of sexual orientation as a protected grounds under asylum law. And I situate it within the context of U.S. constitutional law and this understanding of homosexuality in the United States that has developed over time. And then I argue that the disaggregation of status and conduct, of thinking about those two things, is really different amongst people. While it may have been politically necessary, judicially necessary in that particular moment, that it's actually helped contribute to this very narrow, very static, and very Western and white identity and racialized understanding of homosexuality that exists today in U.S. asylum law. And that exists particularly in the face of immigration judges and recently the Ninth Circuit. I argue that this conception of homosexuality has contributed to the denial of asylum claims to people who don't fit within this very narrow definition of what a homosexual is under U.S. asylum law. And then so finally after that I argue that in the wake of Lawrence v. Texas, this divide is no longer necessary. This divide that came about in 1990 is no longer necessary in current case law, and I critique decisions that have come down after Lawrence that hold on to this disaggregation. There was a case in 2006 that denied asylum to a person on the basis that he was persecuted on account of his engagement in same-sex sexual conduct with someone, not because he was gay. So to begin, it's really important to understand that the first case to grant asylum to someone on the basis of sexual orientation happened in 1990. And that was only 4 years after the Supreme Court upheld in Georgia, the statute in Georgia that criminalized sodomy. So in the United States before then, there were all of these conceptions of homosexuality in 1986, and I'm talking about popular conceptions in the law. This conception that homosexuality was a sin, that it was a deviation from sexual norms, that it was criminalized behavior, but above all, that it was an act, and that sexual act gave rise to a type of person who engaged in it. So that's what a homosexual was under U.S. law and the conceptions of how U.S. law and popular culture thought about gay people. There was definitely growing movements to change this, to change this deviant understanding of what homosexuality was. And this came in the wake of the sexual revolution, in the wake of the feminist movement, and increased sort of an increasing vocal gay rights movement to think about homosexuals, but there was still this prevailing understanding of homosexuals and queer people as being treated as people who were having aberrant gay sex. So this was particularly true during the rise of the AIDS crisis as we were thinking about how sexual activity amongst gay people was contributing to the spread of HIV. And this understanding of homosexuality was particularly salient in the Supreme Court's ruling of Bowers v. Hardwick. And it was that moment in which the court said very clearly, homosexuality is about engaging in gay sex. Sodomy statutes that barred same-sex sexual conduct were completely allowed, and they were constitutionalized. And a person could be prosecuted in the United States for engaging in same-sex sexual conduct. So in the wake of that decision, in the wake of the removal of sort of privacy-based arguments in the United States, gay rights activists began to reframe the debate about protection for gay men and lesbians, and to reshape identity, to really start to think about and really push for this normalcy that Amanda was talking about in her paper, to think about sexual orientation as sort of a very specific type of identity that was worthy of protection. And this was the sort of normalizing that was occurring in terms of popular conceptions. And it was a type of normalizing that was sort of disaggregated from sex. So that homosexuality was sort of a quasi-ethnic identity that was different than the type of sex that queer people were having. And part of that is this argument that came from the continued criminalization of homosexuality and of gay sex. So to tell this story, I definitely rely on lots and lots of scholars who have made these arguments, definitely much more articulately than I have and much more strongly than I have over years and years of scholarship. That's the beauty of being a student, is lots and lots of footnotes. But to sort of demonstrate this development in the law, probably the most telling example of this reinvigoration of a type of gay identity is Romer v. Evans, right? So it's a case in which the court struck down an amendment to the Colorado Constitution which forbid legislatures and cities from passing ordinances prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. There wasn't a single reference in that case to Bowers. That was very much just about identity. And it was at this moment in time in the United States that the United States began granting asylum to queer people who had been persecuted on account of sexual orientation. Sort of in this very particular moment in which sodomy was outlawed and gay identity was starting to take over as sort of people who deserve protection. In 1990, there had been a change in immigration law that had removed bars that had previously existed for queer people from immigrating into the United States. And in that same year, the Board of Immigration Appeals granted asylum to Fidel Toboso Alfonso, who was a gay man from Cuba who had come to the U.S. during the Muriel boat lift. So under asylum law, it's worth noting that as I talk about this, I'm not providing a broad critique of asylum law. There are a lot of amazing critiques out there that really deconstruct the way in which the United States grants asylum, the way in which we, in our asylum system, conceptualize other countries and provide critiques of other countries. That's not this paper, although I do implicitly and explicitly reference some of those critiques in the paper. But this is a much smaller piece than that kind of critique. So just a note on asylum: to apply in the United States, a person has to show that they're a refugee and they're unable to prevail himself or herself of the protection of the home country because of persecution and a well-founded fear of persecution in the United States. We don't offer asylum. It's a class-based persecution, so or class-based protection. So in order to get protection in the United States under asylum, you have to be persecuted on account of your race, religion, nationality, political identity, or membership in a particular social group. So in 1990, the Board of Immigration Appeals said that homosexuality constituted a particular social group. They decided in 1990 that homosexuality was an immutable characteristic. So that was a huge deal because no one else was saying that homosexuality was an immutable characteristic. So they made that determination. But in drawing that line, they had to say that the person who was persecuted, who was coming over to the United States, was actually persecuted on account of his homosexuality and not for engaging in same-sex sexual conduct. Because had they granted it for engaging in same-sex sexual conduct, they would have legitimately had to grant asylum to people in Georgia who were prosecuted under constitutional laws. So the United States drew this really, really stark distinction between status and conduct as the result of that case. And in this case, so that's where we stand in this case, in Ray Toboso Alfonso. The INS made a really strong argument saying that homosexuality was socially deviant behavior. Homosexual activity is not a basis for finding a social group within the contemplation of the act, and that such a conclusion would be tantamount to awarding discretionary relief to those involved in behavior that is not only socially deviant in nature, but in violation of the laws or regulations of the country as well. So the U.S., in that moment, drew a really, really stark divide between status and conduct. And that's where we're left today. So under immigration law, people are forced to prove that they fit in with this conception of gay identity that is disaggregated from conduct. And the problem is within immigration law, that is a very Western white notion of what sexual orientation is, in which people who are coming forward have to prove that they are gay within that conception in the United States. So people are asked, do you go to gay clubs? Do you participate in gay pride parades? Irrespective of the fact that those might not be representative of a person who's coming to the United States fleeing from another country. So they're put in this position of having to prove it. So my paper really argues and tries to situate that position that we're in today as the results of 1990. And then I go on to argue that post Lawrence v. Texas, we don't have to do that anymore. There's no longer this bar on sodomy statutes, and we're no longer in this position in which people have to disaggregate status and conduct, which makes sense within the context of that moment, within that concept of our conceptions of identity, but make no sense in immigration law. So.
Okay, and our last panelist is Yvonne My. She is also a 3L, and she's also enrolled in the CRS program. She's the co-chair of Asian Pacific Islander Law Student Association from 2006 to 2007, and was also the president of the National Asian Pacific American Law Student Association from 2006 to 2007. She's currently the comments editor for the Asian Pacific American Law Journal, and she's going to be working as an associate for Little Medicine upon graduation. And also very exciting, she's invited to teach race in the law at UC Berkeley during the summer of 2009. That's very exciting. That's amazing. Congratulations. And the title of her paper is Intersectionalities of Race, Gender, and Sexuality in Male Prisons.
Hello. I didn't realize I did so many Asian-oriented things, so she read that. Anyways, my paper focuses on the intersectionalities of race, gender, and sexuality, specifically within a male prison rape context. What started all this was that I took a class in human rights and sexual politics, and we learned a lot about prison rape and how it's like taboo in society. It's a butt of a lot of jokes. We watch a lot of sitcoms where people make fun of it. We don't see the real consequences that it has on not only general society, but communities of color. So I started doing some research because I realized in the class discussions themselves, there wasn't a lot of focus on people of color and how it affected them. So just some background facts to put it all in context. Federal, U.S., and state prisons currently have about 2.3 million prisoners. And even though the U.S. only has 1/20th of the world's population, it houses 1/4 of the world's prisoners. And on average, the average prisoner only has 11 years of schooling, a third of them are African American, and a growing number are Latinos. So we went back through the history to see, well, who's actually done studies of prison rape and how it affects people of color. Like Regina, I was really excited. I was like, okay, there's going to be a bunch of articles written on this. I'm just going to footnote. It's going to be great. Wrong. There was like 2 articles. And I was like, oh, that's really sad because it meant a lot of people just have never really cared enough about this issue to properly study it. And then, so what I found was the first study was done in 1966 through 1968 by a sociologist named A.J. Davis. And he took 3,304 prisoners and hooked them up to polygraph tests, which we know are not 100% reliable. And he found that 156 of them had been involved in or a victim of prison rape. And then a 1983 study said that only 2 out of 330 were raped. In 2000, the U.S. reported 16% of all inmates had been raped. So you can see this huge disparity of, we don't know where these numbers are coming from, we don't know where the factors of race or whatever, aggression, age, whatever, have been taken into account. And the most recent study, which is the one I critique in my paper, is the one done by Human Rights Watch in 2001, where they took 200 prisoners from 37 states, and they said that whatever number was raped there, they just generalized to the entire population. And their conclusion was that it is mainly black aggressors on white victims, and to a much lesser extent, intraracial rape, as in like black on black, Latino on Latino, and even lesser was just like white on white rape. And their explanation for having so many black aggressors on white victims was that this was the norms of a violent black subculture and social conditioning that encourages aggressiveness and the use of force. And it's also a revenge mentality for general white dominance. And so I found this, I know, what? That was my reaction. I was like, okay, this is a joke, right? It's so ridiculous that they would write this, and I started researching the methodologies that were used. What would actually make them come to this conclusion of this very complex topic? So some of the limitations in their methodology was they advertised in prison literary magazines. In English, when most prisoners have a reading level, literacy level of 1, which means complex sentences will confuse them. You're not going to ask them if they've been raped. First of all, it's a really touchy subject. In like a written survey. And they're not, I mean, who's going to volunteer for that? Literate white men. Yes, I've been raped by a black. There you go. There's all the statistics that you have for your conclusion. Latinos, a lot of them have a language barrier. The prisons offer no translators whatsoever, and I doubt any of them would actually even pick up one of these magazines, which is English only. So that cuts out a whole other population. Let me talk about some of the research that I did on black rapes, which means a white aggressor on a black victim, because I started researching all these different articles, which were mostly not studies, but narratives of actual prisoners who had been raped. And so black prisoners would say, you know, there are white gangs, white like Aryan Brotherhood gangs, that would rape on the notion that they wanted a black punk. A punk would be someone who would be receiving the rape. The scholar William Pinar compares this to modern-day lynching, because there's historical accounts of white masters raping their black slaves, and it's been embodied in our society so much that the black male figure represents like a sexual prowess that's threatening, of hyper-masculinity. So to like subdue that would be the ultimate power for them. And so a lot of white Aryan brothers would feel that power if they were to rape a black man, which of course is not analyzed in this very popular study that HRW did. Another thing is, within prisons, it's mainly dominated by gangs. People are separated off into a Latino gang, black gang, Filipino gang, white gang, whatever. How you gain status through those gangs is through doing favors, through violent actions such as rape. If you start off low on the bottom, you're going to be raped by people of your own color to get initiation. Like, okay, you've been touched by this gang. You're our property now. We're going to protect you. Nobody from any other gang can touch you or rape you. Only we can. So, in a way, those prisoners might not fathom that what's happening to them is actually rape, because they see rape as, oh, if I get raped by another gang, that's rape. These people, even though they violate me unwillingly, I would rather accept that protection than to be what they call a free rider in the prison who just rides all the different gangs and are sold for like packets of cigarettes. Like, here's 2 cigarettes, I get them for a night. And they would rather just be in their own gang suffering the rape and not tell anyone. So these are some of the limitations of the methodologies, because they don't take that into account. They don't take that into account. They don't take into account the fact that a snitch or a rat, someone who reports prison rape, people give them the green light to just go and kill them, rape them, do whatever, because the snitch is seen as like the bottom rank, you know, of the prison hierarchy. So what was I saying? So yeah, so based on that hierarchy, there's also a limitation in the way that they focus on the way people of color would report raping. So such as Amanda mentioned earlier, there's a lot of cultural differences in views of masculinity within like the Latino and black culture. There's the strong history of homophobia since the civil rights movement, machismo, all the dominant roles that males are supposed to play. They're not going to talk about it to an anonymous survey for like a nonprofit. It's a very touchy issue. They don't even talk about it after they leave prison, which is one of the effects that it has on people of color outside of prison, because 9 out of 10 prisoners will eventually be released. A lot of people don't know that, but it's true. So we think, oh, you know, they're prisoners, they deserve it, they can be raped all day long, I don't care. Well, guess what? They're coming back out into society, and whatever diseases they have, as shallow as this reasoning may be, it's going to come back to us. So that's why you see a rise in black female and Latino female HIV and AIDS rates when their husbands or partners have been through prison and they've been allegedly monogamous, but they don't talk about it. There's that whole dominance role that the Human Rights Watch never analyzed. And so what my paper's conclusion focuses on is on, 1, how the law right now is ineffective, and 2, where the problem really lies. So where the law falls short is the first case that actually recognized that prison rape was unconstitutional was Farmer v. Brennan, where plaintiff was a pre-opt, I believe he was pre-opt transsexual, and he was in his own special ward because they knew that he would get a lot of he would get a lot of problems if he was in the general population of the prison. They punished him for hoarding underwear. I guess like prisoners are supposed to get like 2 pairs each or something. I guess he took like 4 or 6, or he was just hoarding them. He just wanted to be clean. And so as a punishment, they like threw him out to the general population, where he was gang raped on like the first night, I think by like 16 different people. And as a result, he got AIDS. They let him stay there for like a period of like months. And this guy was just destroyed. And then, so Farmer v. Brennan said that was unconstitutional. But although that's a good thing, they still laid the burden of proof on the plaintiff, saying that you have to prove that the prison guards breached their duty to protect you. A problem there is, how are you going to prove that when prison guards are outnumbered by prisoners, and it's a well-known fact that prison guards do use rape as a control methodology to control the prison population. If I'm going to let this person get raped by this gang for tonight, and that will just satisfy that gang so that they won't have a riot the next day, I'm going to do that. That's the prison guard mentality. So if you report, they're not going to do anything about it. So it's a very hefty and almost unrealistic burden to put on the plaintiff. Another thing is that the root of the problem that I talk about is mainly that it doesn't just start within colors within prison. Like, you don't walk into prison and realize, oh, I'm of this race, there's gangs. It starts with poverty, education, where people are first segregated. In housing, you're segregated. Poor populations versus middle class, upper populations. You know what the colors are. Schooling, that's where the gangs start. Schooling and on the streets. Prison gangs control street gangs, and like vice versa. It's not a 2 separate sphere world. It's totally connected. So in order to, quote unquote, fix these problems, there needs to be, first of all, comprehensive prison rape research. And they need to tie in all these social factors that leads up to the prison industrial complex if you truly want to fix the problem. And that's my research.
So we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So I'm just going to open up the floor to anybody ask questions. And if you can come up and use the microphones on either side, so the panel's being recorded and videotaped. Great.
Or you can just yell from where you are.
First, thank you for your presentations. They were amazing. We learned a lot. We really appreciate you guys putting yourselves out there. My question is in relation to, CRS is, there's a relationship in CRS between theory and praxis. So being that you guys researched and studied and wrote about some really interesting topics, my question is how do we put that into practice? And so this symposium is going to be about intersectionality between race and sexuality. But clearly from your papers, there's a number of other sort of identities that are involved in this, right? So we talked about immigration status, and we talked about liberty status, and national origin, and familial relationships, and socioeconomic status. So there's a lot of things that go into all the topics that you guys addressed today. The question I have is, how do NGOs, community organizations, nonprofit organizations, how can they address all of these things at once, right? So we have an organization that's committed to helping immigrants, and we have organizations that are committed to helping survivors of domestic violence. How can those organizations effectively address all of the issues that you brought up today? And can we really put the onus on them to know everything about all these issues? And if so, then that's a question you guys need to answer. And I know it's complicated, sorry. I'm sure you have some good ideas, though. Or are there other manners in which all of these organizations could address the issues that you guys have discussed today in a way that's more intersectional? Does that make sense?
Well, I guess I would say many of these organizations, first of all, are funded by the government, so there is an inextricable link to that. I don't think the onus should be put on NGOs, and especially if we're going to follow our Constitution, which everyone should have the liberty of pursuit of happiness, whatever, just to be safe as a human being for being themselves, then the government should be changing their laws through the pushing of NGOs. NGOs are really just supposed to like represent how the people are feeling, what's happening to the people, and provide that information to the government, who should find it fit to change the laws and make it easier for those who are suffering to gain access.
I mean, as a student, I hear that and I'm like, what? No. But I think one thing that organizations can do is there's so many law students and undergraduate students who are willing to volunteer their time, and one of the things that we did at the LA Gay and Lesbian Center is that we did all the research, not just about we did all the practical stuff, take intakes and things like that, but during our spare time we did research, and then we kind of gave those reports to the attorneys who don't have the time to read about those things. And by keeping the conversation going, for example, part of the domestic violence project at the LA Gay and Lesbian Center is that they do training for West Hollywood police officers so that they will be more aware of the fact that there is domestic violence that exists in same-sex relationships. And by making this education available to the officers, that's one step towards educating the public. And even though they can't make that education mandatory, and it is just in West Hollywood, I feel organizations can have some sort of power in that sense, is that they can start little by little, and then maybe that trend will continue elsewhere.
I think also the Sylvia Rivera Law Project is a great example of the progressive approach that would encompass what you're talking about, multiracial, multi-class, including immigration rights. It's really about looking at the points where these intersect and addressing the issues on all the levels necessary to really achieve change. And I really encourage everybody to go to that afternoon session. It's going to be incredible.
Well, for me, what I saw was a lot of my work, it was dealing with just the first and the second steps, like the politics of identity and then creating awareness. But the challenges and the barriers that we face is after we create awareness, well, then what happens? So after we get the young women in the program to say, okay, well, teen pregnancy is a reality, HIV/AIDS is a reality, well, then the issue then becomes, okay, well, I can't afford birth control. So, and even if I could afford birth control, I live in conditions where I live with my 5 brothers and sisters and my mother, and then they'll find it. And so I even if I could afford it, I probably couldn't use it. And then the next step became, okay, well, what about other contraceptives such as condoms? And then it was sort of well, I don't want to go to the local colmado to get a condom because everyone there knows each other, and people there know my mother and my parents, and so people talk and there's a lot of cheese made. And so for us, it sort of speaks to your question, a lot of the onus can't be put on us because a lot of the barriers are cultural, are socioeconomic barriers, and nonprofits can't handle that. And to some degree, the onus has to kind of shift back. So that's what I saw.
I also think that there's just in terms of thinking about the issues of understanding the places in which there are obstacles in terms of intersections and those kinds of things, and working within coalitions, realizing that I think this has happened sort of within the modern mainstream gay rights movement, of this understanding of sort of speaking as a representative voice without an understanding that one can't speak as a representative voice across singular movements, because there are intersections and there are places in which different interests diverge and those kinds of things. So working in coalition to sort of think about and talk about those intersectionalities, I think, is key. But hopefully we'll all go out into the world and not be students and think about these things sort of within the practice and praxis. Learn more.
Yes. First, I have an idea, which I just want to throw out there and would love the panel to respond to. I wonder if
novelty in discourse, and I'm wondering whether or not intersectionality has always existed, but its marginalization is because it hasn't been formally recognized. So I don't know if you guys have thoughts on that or have thought about it already, but something that I was thinking of. And then I have a more specific question for Shayla.
When I first started writing this paper, this paper was for a class that was not a CRS course. And when I said that the anti-domestic violence movement failed because it was led by white women, like everyone was just like, oh my God, like, what did you just say? Like, but the thing is, like, you're absolutely right in the sense that nobody really thinks that, like, something that's so positive could have such negative effects just because it's so narrowly, like, because the perspective is so narrow. But then the thing is, like, all the theories, like, and all the movements that start, it's like, it starts with, like, narratives, and if the narratives are, like, coming from just one group, like, it's not really going to lead to, like, adequate remedies for, like, everyone else. And I think I agree with you, like, that nobody really understands, like, intersectionality, because I certainly didn't, like, even, like, consider or think about it until, like, I started taking CRS courses, and then you, like, learn about it, and you're like, well, duh, you know? So, in my paper, I quoted Professor Corbata, who said, racism requires white privilege, sexism requires male privilege, homophobia requires heterosexual privilege. And you have to, I think you're right, because in the sense that we have to, like, think of all these privileges and really accept them as, like, being true, like, instead of saying, oh, I don't know, like, you know, there's kind of racial equality, before we, like, recognize that there is, like, huge marginalization that's going on. I don't know.
Well, if you don't have thoughts on that, or anyone else doesn't have thoughts on that, I'll just ask a question for Shayla, which has to do with what you were talking about in relation to the status versus conduct idea. And I'm wondering whether or not you think the disconnect between status and conduct broadens or limits conceptions of queer identity. And also whether or not you can think of or have thought of ways that we can subvert that dichotomy.
I think that's a great question. I mean, in terms of thinking about, I think this is a sort of a question that comes up a lot, right? Whether we want to think about status, which tends to lead us down the path of equality-based arguments, or conduct, which tends to lead us down the path of, like, liberty-based arguments. And I think a lot of times there's this idea that if status and conduct are tied together, then it becomes more about one's identity as a queer person, because that they sort of intersect and intertwine together. And I think those were a lot of criticisms that came up about Lawrence v. Texas. And I actually talk about that in my paper, about the way in which Lawrence sort of bridged that divide and made it about both status and conduct together. There's a lot of criticism that says that Lawrence v. Texas puts forth this sort of one notion of gay identities, and that's really counter, and that's really limiting if it does put forth this sort of one notion of queer identity. And that was something that I definitely struggled with in my paper. And I think within the context that I'm talking about in terms of immigration, which is sort of a limited perspective, it's this idea that right now, what we have with such a stark divide is really limiting. Because by taking conduct entirely out of the mix, it means that we're defining sexual orientation and homosexuality just by status, just by identity. And so within the immigration context, if you put the two of them back together, then you provide room for alternate conceptions of identity that are predicated on just conduct. So.
Over here, and then
I have a question for Yvonne. You gave the anecdote about the transgender woman and her experience after being released back into the general public of prison. And I think that really speaks to the role
this is not particular to my paper. It's not in my paper, but I was doing some side research on LA jail, because we have one of the first prisons that segregate not only by women, like women's jails and men's jails, but within men's jails we have an LGBT section, which is actually kind of interesting because to actually get into that section, they ask you questions similar to what Shayla was saying. Do you go to the parades? Do you know where the Abbey is, which is like a gay club in West Hollywood? They ask these things, and it's like two straight white males, and they go and I don't know who they ask, maybe another white gay male to show them around what's gay in LA. And then so they're like in the know, you know? So then like they show, so when they, because the whole ideology behind it is, well, if you take out the gays, there won't be any rape. Because raping is a gay thing. Wrong. Because now there's just more like vicious violence within the heterosexual population. And it's weird because it's like, they say don't do it, but within the LGBT section, they give out like free condoms every week. So they get more protection in terms of what they get to do, whether it's willing or unwilling, than the heterosexual population, because there's that like notion of gender, you know, that straight men would never rape straight men.
Did you want to go?
Yeah.
So we have one last question. Sorry.
This is just kind of like a general question. Because like you said earlier, I've just kind of been tracking like who's in the panel. You know, everyone in the panel has some type of like marginalized identity. And then also like tracking the people like in this group. A lot of people of color, a lot of women, kind of like, you know, face characteristics, identities that you can see, and like who's missing like in the panel. And so in regards to Regina that was saying, you know, racism is a product of white privilege. Homophobia is a product of heterosexual privilege. How can, you know, we as inmates, how do we who have like marginalized identities kind of like reach, you know, like the people who are in like the agent group or the people that have the power, like, and the privilege to like make changes like in laws? Do you see that like in your program? Like, are there people who are like in the dominant groups who do care about these issues that kind of oppress like marginalized groups, or is it just, you know, it's just kind of like one of those things that like you see it like over and over again. It's like people who are invested in these issues also have marginalized identities. Like, how do we kind of go beyond that and kind of have a discourse where people in the majority are involved and invested?
Well, maybe we can throw out do you want to throw out your question, and then we can, because we do have to close up really quick, but if we could throw out a question, then we can continue the dialogue, because we do
People
have
in
to
the
go.
audience answer? Oh, she wants to respond.
Well, I've been struggling with that question myself, but one thing I would say is when I have gone abroad, the funny thing is some of the reactions that I have had of when there is that like agency group involved is, you're not coming here to do that Peace Corps mentality, are you? And so, I mean, I feel like almost when we reach that step where there is sort of this like mutual involvement, that it doesn't, the involvement itself doesn't replicate the imperialist structure that we're trying to break down. And so that I feel like that's almost a necessary second step, because I've certainly seen the, you know, I don't want to say anything bad about Peace Corps, but
Yeah.
Right. I just want to respond to that really quickly. I just want to acknowledge that everybody in this room has privilege of some sort that puts us in a position of power and agency, and we need not like get white straight men to agree with us in order to do something about all of these things. I mean, just as educated folks, period, we already are in a place of privilege, right? And there are people in here who I'm sure are heterosexual, who have that sort of privilege, and you know, I'm sure I don't need to explain it all the way through, but I don't think we need
Well, my whole concept is that sexuality is fluid, and that I don't believe that there is, like, if you're straight, you have no desire whatsoever for other men, and if you engage in one act of homosexuality, then you are therefore now gay. It's an issue of power within the prison. It's not so much sexual desire. It's power, it's politics, it's prison gangs. So while these males, many of these males conduct homoerotic behavior, they would still consider themselves straight upon interview and upon release into outside society.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, the panelists. You guys are very inspiring to one else, so thank you. Stella was going to really quick let everybody know what's happening from here on out for the next panel.
Thank you. How about one more round of applause for our student moderator and all of the CRS students who presented. So we want to thank all of you again for being the early birds and getting here for the full punch of what the CRS program is attempting to construct here within the law school, but also as part of a larger school of thought out of which this program is born. My name is Saul Sarabia. I have the privilege of serving as the program director here and working with these amazing students. So I have a very, very privileged job. And I want to just say to those of you who are in the audience who are thinking about law school and thinking about this program in particular, that if your sense is that you don't think you'll get this anywhere else, you will not. So definitely encourage you to look into our program and support it throughout the day. I want to say a little bit about what's next and map out the day with our symposium. Just as a little bit of context, this is the second annual of our program-wide symposium. It really began as a student-driven idea a couple of years back with some of the members of the class of 2006 and other students who were here, who came to the program and said, you know, we have the benefit of being here for 3 years and engaging all of these great race theorists and legal scholars. We'd like to create a platform with the faculty to really showcase that. And so every year we've established some really great traditions in planning the process. So we have a student committee, an alumni committee, and individual students interested in different parts of the day. And I hope that you'll get a sense of how much of that collaboration help makes today happen as you go along. Not the least of which is this student panel that was really designed to show how the school and how we in the program provide a structure, but how students bring their own individual experiences and intellectual insights and use that structure to deepen and to challenge us in taking critical race theory to the next level. So we like to say that the mission of the Critical Race Studies program is to think new ideas, to teach new scholars, and to transform racial justice advocacy. And clearly, I think today's panel is a good example of what it will take to do that, which is your ideas and the ideas of the next generation. So really glad that you got to see this. What we're going to do now is we're going to have a small break, and then we're going to move to room 1447, which is to my left and then over in one of the wings of the law school. You'll see another sign with our poster up there. And one of the other traditions that was established in the first annual symposium was how to take up the theme of each year's symposium in a less formal environment, and really creating more space for us to have a round table where we can actually see each other. So the classrooms over there are set up differently. And the purpose of the round table is really to engage in a discussion where all of the participants can weigh in on some of the reasons that brought you to the panels and the symposia today, and to engage in a different type of discussion. Usually the conversation there draws a little bit more on the personal, although these panelists have certainly done a really great job of that, and we invite you into that conversation if that's what you're interested in. The topic for this year is going to explore navigating race and sexual orientation in law school and in related institutions, and promises to be a really interesting discussion. One that we also hope will lead to suggestions about what we might do as a program coming out of the symposium to continue whatever seems fruitful out of today's sessions. So that will be in 1447. It'll start in 10 minutes at 10:45. We'll go until noon in the roundtable discussion, and then we've given you a break to get yourself some lunch. If you're familiar with the campus, Louval is the closest place where you can buy lunch, and North Campus is a little further away. If you're a panelist, we ask you to stick around here. We're providing lunch for all of you in 1314. And then we have the faculty moderated panels in the afternoon that are in your program. Those will all be in this room for the rest of the day after the lunch break. And then we do have a reception and want to invite all of you to stay if you can at the end of the keynote address, which will also be in this room. The reception is going to be held in the south lobby, which is basically the entrance of the law school to my right. And we'll have some light hors d'oeuvres there and a program that involves recognizing some of our alumni who I'm glad to see in the audience and happy to have them back. So thank all of you for being here. Enjoy your day, and we'll see you in 1447.